Thank you for joining these Inclusion Minutes, folks. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about free speech and inclusivity, friends or foes. Now, those of you who attended my last talk at the Inclusion Minutes last year, remember I spoke about inclusive CS examples and how not to end up like a Travolta. I wrote a blog post about that after that, and that got read widely, including at the NSF. And Jeff Forbes, for example, is the head of the BPC initiative. Sigmod invited me to be the inaugural diversity and inclusion chair, and I wrote up an article for authors and others to consider diversity and inclusion as part of their communications as well. And that article was picked up by other communities, including security and data mining, and has been circulated. Now, I don't expect everything that I talk about to have this kind of an impact, but today I wanted to share with you about my thoughts on free speech, because I absolutely love free speech. It's one of the reasons I came to academia. It allows me to share memes like this, battle between monsters, for example, between Ullman and Stonebreaker. In the database community, we know about this battle for decades. Stonebreaker went about saying database theory is useless and database systems is best, and that's what funding agencies should fund. Then Ullman rebuts that by saying database theory is useful. It has had impact on many topics throughout the history of database industry. And then you have Keams chasing the two monsters, and that happens to be David DeWitt. He likes to work with database theoreticians and like to convert them to do database systems work as well. So we like these sorts of war stories in the database world. Unfortunately, one of these, who happens to be an academic grandparent of mine, another one also happens to be an academic grandparent of mine, one of them actually broke my heart and heard an earful from me recently. But this talk is not about that. This talk is about more general principles and hopes that I'd like to share from my standpoint. I'll start with some basic facts. The fact is, no nation on earth offers free speech. Of course, if you start your own nation in Antarctica, yeah, sure, with penguins, maybe you can. But all free speech rights everywhere are fettered. And by fettered, I mean this, basically chains, restraints that hold you back. Even the vaunted First Amendment that Americans like to tout as the paragon of free speech has its fetters, repeatedly upheld by unanimous Supreme Courts, including justices from the left and the right. These are very reasonable things, including incitement, obscenity, defamation, child porn, threatening the president, and so on. In fact, fettered freedom is the foundation of civilization itself. And we've known about this since even the time of ancient Egyptians. They embodied, they personified truth, justice, and order in the form of Ma'at. And then Apep, also called Apophis, is the great serpent that's the embodiment of untruth, injustice, chaos. And the great god Ra perennially fights with Apep every day, every night, and upholds Ma'at. And this happens eternally. Fast forward 7,000 years, and we have now another, probably the most famous fetters, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, embodied in many constitutions around the world as fundamental rights, civil rights, and so on. These fetters did not fall from the sky, created by the great god Ra. They were created, updated, deleted by a delicate mix of humans in the form of top-down design using transparency and bottom-up accountability mechanisms. We are familiar with bottom-up accountability mechanisms such as democracy. Another example is revolutions. But there's also top-down design that has transparency. Here's one example of top-down design of such fetters. Now, these men are not drag queens at a Hillcrest nightclub midnight party, although their makeup and wigs may potentially mislead you. Likewise, these pissed off when forlorn-looking men were actually the Constitution Drafting Committee of the Republic of India. So these are the fetters for these nations. UCSD, we cherish and value free speech and free expression, and we have a duty to uphold it. UCSD also has its fetters. We have the principles of community. People who go around touting anti-Semitic, anti-Black, homophobic, misogynistic statements all the time egregiously will potentially be dismissed. These fetters are just and necessary because they create an environment of fairness, cooperation, professionalism, and just civil engagement. ACM has its own fetters, promoting highest professional ethical standards, diversity and inclusion in the core values, policy against harassment, so many words devoted to the fetters. One other fact I'd like to share is free speech is not freedom from counter speech. Counter speech is also speech. Counter speech ad infinitum are also free speech. nor is free speech freedom from the consequences of speech. Consequences are governed by the laws, by the society, by the organizations that the speech is part of. And finally, consistency in speech is a desire that's a very powerful human trait that has been there since time immemorial. Cognitive science and social psychology tell us why this is deep rooted in our brain, but history gives us numerous examples where this has been leveraged. One particular example that I like to share is from one of my idols, MLK Jr. In his I Have a Dream speech, he actually mentioned how every American was to fall heir to the promissory note signed by the founding fathers. I don't know about you, but I doubt the founding fathers had that in their mind when they said that, but we only have what they wrote down. We can't say what they had in their minds. And MLK used this to his advantage to convince a lot of white allies to join the cause of Black civil rights, without which I reckon it is unlikely that civil rights would have been promulgated at that time. Moving on, now I'd like to share some hopes that I have. The first one is I hope academic freedom exists to help uphold truth, justice, and knowledge, not for self-aggrandizement of academics, not for fame and money and power and all of that. And society gives us this academic freedom for this reason, and it's our duty to uphold these things. And one of the raison d'etre for academic free speech, which we hear often from our colleagues, is speaking truth to power. And that's very important. So let's break it down. Truth, not lies, half-truths, bullshit, hatred, venom, speaking the truth. To power, not to trample on the powerless, those who cannot afford to speak out, those who do not have a voice, those who are genuinely fearful of extreme negative consequences if they speak. And speaking itself, it is a marketplace of ideas. The marketplace is reined in by the fetters that I talked about. And while speaking, we must also beware of not just logical fallacies, but also this problem of groupthink, also a fallacy. And in particular, in the last few years, one other form of this I've seen is cancel culture. Some of our senior faculty who are not social media savvy may not have heard of this. Cancel culture is basically a form of groupthink, in my opinion, and it's a pitfall. It's unfortunate, but it is also a form of speech that is protected by the First Amendment. Now moving on to the final act. Freedom without responsibility, power without accountability, and both without transparency is a highway to untruth, injustice, and chaos. And thus, it is our duty to uphold these things: responsibility, accountability, transparency for all organizations that we are part of at all levels, from our departments, via our bylaws, to our university, to our state, to our nation, to our professional community. Otherwise, we would all end up in this world of Apophis, gobbled up by the great serpent. Now, one analogy I like to share here is the bias variance trade-off that our ML colleagues teach us. As the model complexity increases, the training error keeps going down, but the test error goes up after a point. This is because you overfit to the data on the right and you underfit on the left. And so there's a dichotomy here, and there's a sweet spot in the middle. One might think there's a dichotomy like this on free speech fetters as well. Overall societal harm actually can become high if you have too many fetters, because it can silence paradigm shifting ideas, and that kind of blindsides humanity. But too few fetters throws marginalized groups under the bus who are already discriminated against. And this could lead to majoritarian extremism. It could lead to wave after wave of genocides. But wait, what if I told you this dichotomy was actually a false dichotomy all along? In the ML world, the understanding of the bias variance trade-off evolved very fundamentally in the last few years. We now know that the train error can actually go down to 0 and the test error can drop again after it goes up. This is called the interpolation regime, and it was characterized by our own colleague, Misha Belkin at HTSI. In the interpolation regime, the test error can actually drop even further below than the sweet spot achieved on the dichotomy on the left. This is one of the key reasons deep learning has been so successful in many applications. I see an analogy for that even on free speech. The false dichotomy means you can actually make fetters sophisticated enough such that your overall societal harm comes down and actually goes further down than the sweet spot you had on the left. I call this the extra prudent regime. Just have definitions and practice and just common sense to be prudent enough to use your free speech rights in that way. As an example, I thought these three grandpas were over there in the sweet spot. Then I stand corrected. I think one is actually over there on the left. But then after thinking about these other two, I think DeWitt is actually on the right over there, extra prudent in the way he has leveraged his speech to influence the research and the industry, especially the database industry with this famous tussle with Ellison and Oracle and so on. So it is possible. To conclude, I think the dichotomy between fettered free speech and inclusivity for marginalized groups is a false dichotomy. And there's, in fact, a virtuous cycle here. Fettered free speech empowers marginalized groups. Forget about crony news media corporations, the web, blogging, social media. They have all enabled marginalized groups to speak more, to speak louder, to voice their concerns, to organize, to canvas for positive change. And that has been transformative over the last couple of decades. In turn, marginalized groups help enrich speech itself. And we have seen this happen in the last few years. I don't know if many of you use streaming platforms. I like to use Netflix, Hulu, and others a lot. And I've seen the amount of content they produce in the last few years has exploded in variety. And there's just so many interesting and engaging content coming out of people who are Black, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, and so on. And that is basically an enriching of speech itself. And we see this happening in government. We hopefully will see this happen in academia as well. Otherwise, we risk society looking at us as irrelevant elitists sitting atop an ivory tower. Thank you.